The Paris Agreement was signed by 195 countries in Paris in 2015 and was hailed as a breakthrough and a new start for global climate action. In what is it so innovative, and how does it work? For 250 years, economic growth has been based on fossil fuel consumption. Some countries have grown faster and earlier at the expense of mankind's GHG budget, and are also better equipped today to adapt to climate change consequences. As a consequence, the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change agreed on a new framework in Rio to fight climate change on the basis of common but differentiated responsibilities. It also specified that industrialized countries, as listed in Annex 1, should lead the transition to an emission-free, climate-resilient development. The question is how to do this in practice. The devil is in the detail. The Kyoto Agreement intended to implement this principle by calculating a global reduction target and sharing this burden according to each party's estimated responsibility and capability. However, non-Annex 1 countries refused binding targets that would sacrifice their development, given the historical responsibility of Annex 1 countries. And some Annex 1 countries refused to follow a treaty if large emitters among the non-Annex 1 countries were not part of it. In 2015, it became clear that the 2 degrees centigrade target would be missed if mankind did not collectively decrease net GHG emissions to zero soon, both reducing existing GHG emissions and increasing GHG absorption. How then account for the common but differentiated responsibilities without opposing Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries? The Paris Agreement's answer to this question was to abandon the regulatory approach for a facilitative framework, in which each country decides its nationally determined contribution, or NDC, based on its own perceived costs, benefits, and capabilities. The European Union, for instance, pledged to reduce its emissions for all GHGs in absolute terms by 40% in 2030, based on emissions in 1990. China committed to peak its CO2 emissions by 2030, and also to reduce the CO2 emissions per unit of GDP by 60 to 65% in 2030 relative to emissions in 2005. Chile promised to reduce its emissions for CO2, CH4, N2O, HFCs and PFCs by 30% per unit of GDP in 2030 relative to 2011, excluding emissions from land use and forestry. This could climb to 45% if international monetary funds are granted. Upwards revisions of these targets every 5 years should help the global effort converge to zero net GHG emissions globally. The agreement hopes to keep the world's temperature increase well below 2 degrees centigrade, and actually specifies that countries should aim for a 1.5 degrees increase as a maximum. And, acknowledging the fact that the climate will change anyway, cooperation on adaptation finally entered the core principles of this agreement. And what about non-state actors? Well, non-state actors are now an integral part of the process. A good example is the We Are Still In coalition, where more than 3,000 mayors, governors, businesses and investors joined forces to make up for Trump's withdrawal from the global effort. COP21 put an end to a situation where everybody waited for someone else to act first, and offered a facilitative framework to foster voluntary action. Enough actors believing they should take action now can make this a reality. So, what does all this imply exactly?